I wanted to write a really different sort of book, based in a historical period which was authentic, but one which was much more fictional than the usual work that I do. And I thought it'd be really interesting to write a book for a slightly younger reader, and a book that had younger heroes and heroines who were also fictional people, who could have extraordinary adventures and really explore what we know about the medieval world in a very exciting and dynamic way. The book starts in 1453, which to the medieval world was really what they called the end of days. Constantinople, the great centre of the Byzantine Empire in the east, where an Eastern Pope lived, where the church was based, had fallen to the Ottoman Empire, which seemed itself quite unstoppable, sweeping across North Africa, up through Europe, and everybody thought it was going to overtake Europe altogether, and Europe would then be fully Muslim, and the Christian religion would have fallen. Everybody thought that would signal the end of the world. And as our book opens, a secret order, papal order, the Order of Darkness, recruits a young man to go out into Christendom and to find out what's happening, what are the signs that the world is ending. And he's going to look at all sorts of spiritual, mystical, superstitious and downright fraudulent happenings all across Europe, trying to understand if it really is the end of the world. I mean, unfortunately for me, there's two things that are really difficult to get in this period, and one is history of women, because people simply don't record women. You only find people talking about women in the chronicles if they're either at very, very important political events or if they're acting in a very effective and political way. And by and large, of course, women, since they have no rights and no power, simply aren't there. They aren't there in the record. You can find out about women by looking at where their fathers and their husbands are. So a lot of the time I'm reading, in a sense, very conventional history of kings or dukes or military leaders, and speculating about whether their wives or their daughters are there at the time. That's a very important source of material. And the other thing is that every now and then you do get some genuine material about the women, that one of the chroniclers is interested in one of the women for one reason or another. But they tend to be the really big players, the queens. The other thing that's really typical of this period is that people don't talk about their internal life. They don't talk about their emotions. They don't talk about their feelings at all. The closest that you get to people discussing their motivation, their conscious or unconscious motivation for doing anything, are the prayers. And it's really interesting because we actually have a prayer book which Richard III annotated, and it contains his favourite prayers. So you can, in a sense, read that, and then you can only speculate as to what he might have been feeling, that these prayers were significant to him. But apart from the practice of their religion and what they say in the confessional, which of course we're never going to know, these are people who don't, in a sense, reflect their private inner life really at all. So the very thing you want to know as a novelist, which is what are people feeling, what's their motivation, is the one thing that you have to, in a sense, create as a novelist. You're never going to find it as a historian. My favourite historical period really has to be the medieval period. I've been working on the Tudors and now the Plantagenets for more than 10 years now, so it's as well that I find them so interesting. But it's a real period where, in a sense, what England is going to be really takes off. The Plantagenets have this long war. It goes on for nearly 20 years one way and another. And during that time, the great families who are going to rule England in the future come to the forefront, establish their power. The regionalism of England is really, in a sense, declared and becomes apparent. That's really important for where we are here, Middleham Castle in the north, which becomes a real powerhouse for England, as it will be when it goes on into the Industrial Revolution. So what England's going to be is really forged in the medieval world, and of itself it's a time where people have to fight for their own power, for their own position. Women, of course, have no rights at all, but that's a time where you see women doing some very, very interesting power behind the scenes sort of work. And so some of the most exciting, dominant women come to the forefront in this period as well. So I think it's a period really which is quite irresistible. As well as that, it's physically very, very beautiful. This is pre-industrialisation. Castles like this dominate a rural landscape. It's a very lovely period, and the colours and the cloth and the buildings are truly beautiful. In the book, of course, since the very theme of the book is the discovery of the unknown world, the unseen world and the unexpected world, we meet all sorts of extraordinary things. The first book in the series it deals with a kind of outbreak of hysteria at a nunnery, and then subsequently a creature which the village identifies as a werewolf. From the point of view of how to write this, it seemed to me really important to write it in a way which took it absolutely seriously, that there's to be no suggestion that this is a silly thing to think. The people at the time thought it, and I want the reader to really experience it as if it were real. Some of the ways I treat some of these things is there is a rational, real-life explanation, an explanation that we, as enlightened, scientific, educated people would understand. Sometimes what occurs defies that sort of explanation. Just as we know in primitive countries today, some of the events still continue to defy a rational explanation. And one of the things that I've done as an author is just confront that, just accept that that's the case. We have to realise, and it's so hard as modern people, is to understand that in the medieval world, they really believed there was an unseen, uncontrollable world which lived, in a sense, just through a veil. Here's the real world, the material world that we would recognise that they live in, and yet at the same time there are all sorts of occurrences which happen in day-to-day life. Manifestations, hauntings, the rise of people from the grave, people being possessed by spirits and demons. They believed that the world, a spiritual world, both good and bad, was around them all the time and intervened in everyday life. And you can see this because sometimes people will swear an oath. We have on the historical record, someone will swear an oath and say that if they're not speaking the truth, will God strike them dead. And on at least a couple of occasions, a man will actually drop dead when he's lying on oath. And of course we have explanations for that now, psychological and physiological, but at the time what people really thought they were experiencing was the unseen spiritual world working on their everyday lives. In a way, I'm a really boring reader now. I read very little fiction, but I read history books almost all the time. So if I'm working on, say, Anne Neville, I'll read pretty well everything I can get my hands on about Richard III, of course about Henry VII, and about her father, Warwick the Kingmaker. So actually that's quite a lot of history books set in that period, and also there's quite a lot of history books now published about women in medieval England or medieval Europe or medieval queens. So there's been quite a lot of general work, but there's only really one biography of Anne Neville, and that's by Michael Hicks. So my day-to-day reading is quite narrow. At night, I read on an e-reader, and on holidays I take my e-reader with me, and then I'm really just catching up with some of the classics that I read a long time ago, or the ones that I should have read and never got round to. So right at the moment I'm reading The Spoils of Poynton, Henry James, which is just fabulous. But what I didn't realise when I read it when I was a young woman, before I was a writer, is how little dialogue there is in it. It's really interesting. If Henry James sent that to an editor today, the editor would say to him, you've got to have dialogue. You can't have these pages and pages and pages of descriptions of the interactions between the characters. You've got to do it live. It's a very distinctive style, and of course it's a great piece of literature. But I don't think it'd get published today, which is perhaps a comment on how we now read and how we write. In terms of what influenced me when I was a young woman, I read a lot of what would now be called the English canon, the kind of the classic literature, Austen, Dickens, Hardy, some of the Russians, not much foreign, and a little of the great American writers. And I find it quite hard to read modern writers because there's so much fantastic material that I've still yet to read. So I tend to read for pleasure classic writing, and for work I read non-stop history.